It was a warm summer evening in 1995 when Sarah and John, a seemingly ordinary couple in their mid-30s, arrived at a small beachside rental on the coast of Oregon. Their plans were simple: a quiet escape from the hustle and bustle of their daily lives. They were hoping for a few days of peace, to relax and enjoy the beauty of the ocean. It was the kind of getaway they both needed after months of work and stress. They had been looking forward to this break for weeks, and the coastal cabin seemed like the perfect place to recharge. Sarah and John had been together for over a decade. Their relationship was strong, built on a foundation of love, trust, and mutual respect. They had weathered life's challenges together, supporting each other through thick and thin. John worked as a high school teacher, while Sarah ran a small art gallery in town. They were both well-liked in their community, known for their warm personalities and the genuine care they showed to others. They had no known enemies, no ongoing conflicts, just a quiet, happy life. The evening they arrived at the cabin was typical for them, filled with quiet conversation, laughter, and excitement about the upcoming days. They unpacked their bags, opened a bottle of wine, and sat on the deck overlooking the ocean, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, the sound of the waves calming, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. They promised each other they would take the time to truly disconnect from their busy lives, leaving their phones and responsibilities behind. The next morning, Sarah and John went out to explore the nearby beach. It was a place they had visited before, but this time, it felt different, more relaxed, more intimate. They walked hand in hand along the shoreline, collected seashells, and talked about the future. They had always dreamed of expanding Sarah's art gallery and perhaps traveling more. But for now, they were content to be in the moment. The hours passed quickly, filled with laughter and simple pleasures. However, things took an unexpected turn on the third day of their trip. It was a Sunday morning when Sarah woke up and noticed that John was missing. The bed beside her was cold, the covers were still tangled from the night before, and there was no sign of him. At first, she assumed he had gone for a walk, or perhaps had stepped outside to enjoy the quiet morning. It wasn't unusual for John to rise early, especially when he was in a new place. He often liked to go for a run or a walk through the area, clearing his mind before starting the day. Sarah went back to sleep, not thinking much of it. But when she woke up again a few hours later, she noticed that John still hadn't returned. It was unlike him to be gone for this long without checking in. Sarah assumed he had just lost track of time, maybe exploring the beach or taking in the scenery. She called out for him, but there was no response. She checked the cabin, walked around the property, and even called his phone, but there was still no answer. The silence grew more unsettling by the minute. By midday, Sarah was starting to feel a sense of unease. John had always been considerate about staying in touch, especially when they were in a remote location. She tried calling him again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Panic slowly began to rise in her chest. She checked the cabin again, thinking maybe he had just gotten caught up in something or lost track of time. But everything appeared normal. His belongings were still there, and there were no signs of him having left. As the hours passed, Sarah's worry deepened. She decided to take a walk down to the beach, thinking maybe John had just taken a longer walk and had lost track of time. But there was no sign of him on the beach either. She walked up and down the shoreline, calling his name, but the only response was the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. When Sarah returned to the cabin, her heart was racing. It was now late afternoon, and there was still no sign of John. She felt a growing panic that she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. She called the local authorities and reported him missing. The police quickly arrived, and a search was launched, but despite combing through the area, there was no sign of John. His car was still parked outside the cabin untouched. His clothes were still in the cabin, and the cabin itself showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. It was as though John had simply vanished. The police began searching the nearby woods, the beach, and the surrounding areas, but there were no leads. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of John. The authorities couldn't find any evidence of foul play. No broken windows, no disturbed ground, no signs that anything had happened. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air. His phone was never found, and there was no activity on his bank account or credit cards. The search expanded, but the mystery only deepened. Sarah was left in a state of disbelief and shock. The man she had spent over a decade with, the person who had been her partner in every sense of the word, was gone. She couldn't accept that he had simply left without a word, especially with no sign of him or any explanation. As the weeks turned into months, the authorities began to slow their search, but Sarah refused to give up. She continued to search the woods and surrounding areas herself, desperate for any clue that might lead her to him. But despite all her efforts, the case went cold. The disappearance of John and Sarah became another unsolved mystery, filed away in police archives, a story that faded from the public eye. Over time, Sarah's search grew quieter. Friends and family tried to offer comfort, but Sarah couldn't accept that John was gone. It didn't make sense. He wouldn't have disappeared like that, not without a trace. He had to be out there somewhere. Years passed, and the case grew colder. Sarah moved away from the cabin, unable to bear the memories that haunted her every day. The once vibrant art gallery she had opened with John slowly faded into the background of her life. The disappearance of her husband was a wound that never healed, a question that was never answered. Then, after years of silence, a new investigator stumbled upon the case. The disappearance of John and Sarah was rediscovered, and what was uncovered would send shockwaves through the small town. The answers were out there, and they would change everything Sarah thought she knew about what happened that summer in 1995. For years, the disappearance of Sarah and John was a haunting mystery that lingered in the small coastal town like an unanswered prayer. The case had faded from the public eye, just another tragic incident in a world full of unsolved puzzles. Yet, even as time passed and the search for answers slowed to a halt, the memories of the young couple never truly disappeared. Whispers of their fate still surfaced in hushed conversations, particularly among the older locals who remembered the days before the town had transformed. There were always lingering questions. What happened to them? Why did they vanish without a trace? And most chillingly, why had no one ever found a single clue? The town had changed since that summer of 1995. New buildings had sprung up along the coastline, and the once quiet streets were now lined with businesses and tourists who knew little about the disappearance of Sarah and John. Yet, for some of the original residents, the mystery still lingered in their minds, haunting their thoughts whenever they passed by the old beachside rental where the couple had last been seen. No answers had ever come, and it seemed as though the case would remain unsolved forever. But some mysteries, it seemed, were destined to be revisited. In 2025, the case would resurface, not through the efforts of local authorities, but thanks to an outsider. Mark Benson, an amateur investigator with a deep obsession for cold cases, had been researching the area's unsolved disappearances when he stumbled across Sarah and John's case. Mark was no stranger to investigating mysteries. He had spent the past decade poring over old reports and tracking down leads on unsolved cases, fascinated by the stories that hadn't received the attention they deserved. When he found the old news articles about Sarah and John, something clicked. The details seemed too strange, too inexplicable to ignore. Mark began reading through the police reports and the articles from the time of the disappearance. He found it odd that despite the extensive search efforts, there had never been a clear explanation of what had happened. The reports mentioned how Sarah and John had vanished without a trace, but there were no real suspects, No physical evidence, and no concrete theories. The police had combed through the area for weeks, interviewed locals, and searched the woods, but they never found anything substantial. The case went cold, and eventually, it seemed to be forgotten. But Mark wasn't ready to let it go. The more he looked into the case, the more he realized that there were inconsistencies and unexplained details that had never been fully explored. There were mentions of strange occurrences in the town in the months leading up to Sarah and John's disappearance. Unusual sightings in the woods, whispers of local legends, and strange behavior from some of the residents who lived near the beach. Mark's curiosity was piqued. What if there was more to this story than the police had uncovered? What if the answer to their disappearance was hidden in plain sight, buried by time and forgotten details? Mark was determined to find out. Armed with the latest technology and a team of volunteers who shared his passion for solving cold cases, he decided to revisit the scene of the crime. The beachside rental, now a popular spot for tourists, was still standing. It had been renovated over the years, but the property remained largely unchanged. Mark's team used advanced ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search the area for anything that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. They carefully combed through the woods around the cabin, hoping to uncover new evidence, but so far, nothing out of the ordinary surfaced. Frustrated but undeterred, Mark decided to dig deeper into the town's history. He visited the local library, pored over old newspapers, and interviewed residents who still remembered the couple's disappearance. Most of the people he spoke to had little to add. Some had moved away long ago, and others had simply forgotten the details. But a few older residents spoke about strange things they had seen during the summer of 1995. One elderly woman remembered that Sarah and John had seemed a little nervous when they checked into the cabin, but she didn't think much of it at the time. Another resident mentioned that there had been rumors of odd lights in the sky around the time of their disappearance. None of this was concrete evidence, but it added to Mark's growing sense that there was something more to the story. After several weeks of research and investigation, Mark contacted the local authorities to ask them to reopen the case. The town's police department had changed hands a few times since 1995, and the current leadership was understandably hesitant. They hadn't been involved in the original investigation, and they were wary of reopening an old case that had already been closed. But Mark's persistence paid off. After much discussion, the department agreed to take a fresh look at the case. The new investigation started slowly, with local authorities retracing Mark's steps and re-interviewing some of the original witnesses. They carefully re-examined the evidence, searching for anything that had been missed all those years ago. Mark's findings didn't lead to any immediate breakthroughs, but they opened up new avenues of investigation. The police began to question local residents once again, this time with a more open mind. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon something unexpected, a small detail that had slipped through the cracks all those years ago. While revisiting the rental property, the team found something buried in the overgrown yard, a small, rusted metal box. It wasn't large, but it looked out of place. Inside the box were several old photographs and some documents, but most shockingly, there was a letter dated just a few months before Sarah and John had disappeared. The letter was written in a shaky hand and mentioned something about a dangerous discovery in the woods. It was unclear what the letter meant, but it hinted that Sarah and John had stumbled upon something much larger than they had realized, something dangerous enough to cause them to disappear. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. The letter suggested that there had been a reason for Sarah and John's disappearance, a reason that no one had ever considered before. It was a clue that tied their case to something far darker than anyone had imagined. Mark and the authorities now had a new lead, but the answers they sought were far from clear. The discovery of the letter raised more questions than it answered, and it pushed the investigation into even more mysterious territory. With the case now reopened and new evidence surfacing, Mark and the authorities were closer than ever to uncovering the truth behind Sarah and John's disappearance. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the answers they sought might be more chilling than anyone had anticipated. The question now was not just who was responsible for their disappearance, but what was the real story behind the strange events in the woods that had remained hidden for so long. The story of Sarah and John was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a tangled web of secrets, lies, and dark forces that had been buried for decades. What had they discovered that had cost them their lives? And what other dangers lay hidden in the shadows of the small town? The investigation had only just begun, but already it was clear that the truth was far more disturbing than anyone had expected. In the summer of 2025, Mark Benson, the amateur investigator who had become obsessed with the disappearance of Sarah and John, returned to the small coastal town with a team of dedicated researchers and investigators. They had spent months poring over old reports, re-interviewing witnesses, and re-examining the mysterious circumstances surrounding the couple's vanishing in 1995. With new technology at their disposal and an unyielding drive to uncover the truth, they headed back to the area where Sarah and John had last been seen, near the secluded beach rental. Mark and his team had already spent countless hours in the woods surrounding the rental, but this time they were more prepared. Equipped with advanced tools like ground-penetrating radar, they began scanning the area methodically, hoping to uncover any disturbances beneath the surface. For hours, they combed through the dense undergrowth, their steps slow and deliberate, each member of the team carefully watching for signs of anything unusual. The forest was thick with old trees, vines, and layers of fallen leaves and debris that had accumulated over the years. The location was remote, far from any regular hiking trails, which made the search even more difficult. As the hours wore on, the team began to feel the weight of frustration. Despite the advanced equipment, there had been no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No buried evidence, no hidden clues. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and the team began to feel the creeping sense of discouragement that comes with a cold case. But Mark, refusing to give up, insisted that they continue scanning one last area, an isolated patch of land just a few hundred feet from the beach rental. It was an area that, for some reason, had never been fully explored during the initial investigations. The team, exhausted but determined, followed Mark's lead, directing the radar equipment across the ground. And then, finally, there it was, a sharp, clear indication on the radar, a disturbance deep beneath the Earth's surface. Something was hidden there, something that shouldn't have been. The team rushed to the spot, their excitement palpable, as they began to dig carefully, their shovels cutting through layers of soil and debris. As the earth was removed, they uncovered something that took their breath away. Beneath the surface, buried in the soil and overgrown with vegetation, was a hidden structure, a small, makeshift shelter that appeared to have been built long ago. It was an odd sight, one that raised immediate questions. The structure was crude, poorly constructed, and completely out of place in the otherwise untouched woods. The frame was built from rough-hewn wood, hastily put together, as though someone had thrown it together in a rush. Moss and dirt covered the surface, hiding much of its details, but it was unmistakably a shelter of some sort, one that had been forgotten by time. The more the team uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a random shack. This was something far more significant, a hidden place, one that had been deliberately concealed, left behind for a reason. Inside, the investigators made a chilling discovery. The shelter was small, barely big enough for one person to lie down in, let alone two. It was cramped, suffocating even, as though it had been designed to trap someone. The air inside was thick and stale, and the team was immediately struck by the feeling that this was not just some abandoned hideaway. It felt wrong, oppressive, and the weight of the situation started to settle in on everyone. But it wasn't just the small, suffocating space that disturbed them. It was what they found inside. Scattered across the floor were remnants of a terrifying and chilling reality. Among the debris, the investigators found items that shouldn't have been there, items that were connected to Sarah and John. There were Sarah's art supplies, sketchbooks, paintbrushes, and partially completed drawings. Evidence of her presence in the shelter, evidence that she had been forced to stay there. There were a few of John's personal belongings, like a broken wristwatch and a small pocket knife, items that would have been with him had he simply gone out for a walk or hike, as Sarah had initially thought. But these things weren't just abandoned. They had been left in a hurry, scattered and abandoned as if the couple had been interrupted, as if they had been forced to leave in a panic. The air grew heavier as the team continued to search the shelter. And then, they found something that stopped them all in their tracks. A small compartment beneath the floorboards. It was barely noticeable, hidden under layers of dirt and rotting wood, but it had been there all along, waiting to be uncovered. The team carefully pried it open, revealing its contents. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was shaky and rushed, clearly written in a state of panic. The journal had been written by someone in distress, someone who had been trapped, confined, and desperate. As they began reading the journal, it quickly became clear that Sarah and John had not disappeared willingly. The entries were filled with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. The couple had not run away or gotten lost. They had been trapped in the shelter. The journal described how they had been kept there by an unseen force, someone or something that had watched them, controlled them, and kept them isolated from the rest of the world. The entries became more frantic as they described the couple's growing sense of fear and their failed attempts to escape. The forest around them had become a prison, and the couple had been desperate to break free, but they were constantly thwarted. One of the most chilling parts of the journal described their discovery of a strange, disturbing presence in the woods. The couple had initially dismissed the odd sounds and fleeting glimpses of figures in the trees as mere imagination. But as the days passed, it became clear that something far darker was at play. The journal entries spoke of whispers in the night, unexplained noises, and the unnerving feeling that they were being watched, always. The more they tried to escape, the more the presence seemed to tighten its grip on them. The final entry read, "We can't stay here anymore. They know we know too much. We have to leave, or we'll never make it out alive." Mark Benson and his team were stunned. They had uncovered a chilling new layer to the mystery, one that painted Sarah and John's disappearance in a terrifying new light. The couple hadn't disappeared because they had run away, nor had they gotten lost. They had been trapped, held captive by something or someone hidden in the woods. But who had kept them here, and why? What did they know that had made them such a threat? And where had they gone after their last desperate attempt to escape? The answers were just beginning to unfold, but they only raised more questions. The discovery of the shelter, the journal, and the horrifying reality of what had happened to Sarah and John was only the beginning of a deeper investigation into the dark, hidden secrets of the woods. Mark and his team were more determined than ever to uncover the truth, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the mystery seemed to become. Sarah and John had uncovered something far larger than themselves, a secret buried in the heart of the forest, one that would change everything they thought they knew about that summer of 1995. As the investigation into the journal progressed, the team began uncovering increasingly shocking and disturbing details. With each new page, the truth behind Sarah and John's disappearance grew darker and more sinister. What had initially seemed like a simple case of two people vanishing during a quiet vacation in a remote area was quickly turning into a much more complex and frightening story. The journal, which had been hidden for years beneath the floorboards of the makeshift shelter, provided the first real clue to the chilling mystery that had haunted Sarah and John's disappearance for decades. The journal's entries began with the couple's initial arrival at the beach rental, describing their excitement about the peaceful retreat they had planned. But as the days wore on, the tone of the journal changed. It became increasingly frantic, revealing that Sarah and John had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. According to the journal, they had unknowingly uncovered the presence of a secret society operating in the area. This underground group, as described in the journal, used the isolated woods as a base for conducting illegal activities, some of which were linked to several unsolved disappearances over the years. At first, Sarah and John had dismissed the strange things they heard at night and the unsettling feelings of being watched. They assumed it was simply the eerie quiet of the woods, the natural sounds of wildlife, and their own imaginations running wild in the isolation of the cabin. But over time, their initial doubts gave way to the harsh reality that something far more sinister was happening around them. They began to hear disturbing sounds at night, unexplained noises that seemed too deliberate to be caused by animals, whispers, footsteps, and low voices that seemed to drift in and out of the woods, always just beyond their reach. These sounds unnerved them, but it wasn't until they began to notice strange figures lurking in the trees at the edge of their property that they realized they were not alone. The couple initially tried to brush it off, convincing themselves that the figures they saw in the distance were simply other hikers or locals. But as the days passed, the sightings grew more frequent and more unsettling. Sarah and John's growing fear became apparent in the journal's pages. They described the constant feeling of being watched, the oppressive sense that something or someone was always just out of sight, waiting. At one point, John wrote in the journal, "Every time I turn around, I feel like someone's watching me, hiding just beyond the trees. It's not just in my head. I can feel it." The couple's paranoia grew, and they started to question whether they were truly alone in the woods or if there was something else at play. They tried to remain calm, convinced that their nerves were simply getting the best of them. But the more they tried to ignore their growing unease, the more the sense of danger escalated. They began to realize that their presence in the woods was not as welcome as they had thought. Sarah's final entry in the journal, written in a rushed, trembling hand, was a cry for help. "They know we know too much. We have to get out now, or we're next." This entry marked the turning point in their story, a moment when they fully understood that they were no longer just vacationers in a quiet corner of the world, but victims caught in a larger, more dangerous scheme. From that point on, the couple's attempts to escape grew more desperate. They tried to leave the cabin and head for the nearest town, but each time they ventured toward the edge of the woods, they were met with obstacles. The strange figures they had seen earlier seemed to be everywhere, watching their every move, blocking their path. There were no clear signs of who these people were, but it was becoming increasingly clear that Sarah and John had unknowingly wandered into the territory of a powerful, secretive group that would stop at nothing to protect their operations. The journal detailed their growing isolation and fear. There were no phone signals, no way to contact the outside world. They had become trapped, cut off from help, and with each passing day, the situation grew more dire. They couldn't leave without encountering the unknown figures in the woods, and staying in the cabin felt just as dangerous. Sarah wrote about the suffocating feeling of being watched, and John described how their every move was being monitored. "We're being hunted," one of his last journal entries read. "They know we're onto them, and they won't let us go." As the days wore on, Sarah and John's fear deepened, and their attempts to escape became more frantic. The journal mentioned strange rituals that they had overheard during their time in the woods. They heard chants in the distance at night and witnessed odd lights flashing through the trees. Sarah even wrote about strange symbols carved into the trees near the cabin, symbols she didn't recognize but felt sure had a deeper meaning. They had discovered something they were never meant to uncover, something so dangerous that it cost them their freedom. The journal made it clear that Sarah and John had been kept captive, not because they had wandered too far off the beaten path, but because they had uncovered the secret society operating in the woods. They had learned too much, and in doing so, they had become a threat to the group. The journal revealed the lengths to which the society would go to keep their activities hidden. The couple was watched constantly, their every movement tracked, their every action scrutinized. They were no longer just victims of circumstance. They had become prisoners in a twisted game played by people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As the investigation continued and new evidence came to light, the authorities began to piece together the terrifying truth. Sarah and John's disappearance had been part of a much larger conspiracy. The secret society that had been operating in the woods had a far-reaching network, involved in illegal activities ranging from smuggling to ritualistic practices that spanned decades. Their operation had been carefully concealed, and anyone who got too close to the truth was silenced. The investigation now pointed to the possibility that Sarah and John had been the victims of this group, targeted for their curiosity and their accidental discovery of something much darker. But the questions remained. Who were the people behind the society? What were they truly after? And how far would they go to protect their secrets? As the authorities continued their investigation, it became clear that Sarah and John had not been the first to disappear in the area, and they likely wouldn't be the last. This was not an isolated case. It was part of a larger, more insidious network that had been operating right under the nose of local authorities for years. The truth was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined, and Sarah and John's disappearance was just the beginning of an even darker tale waiting to be uncovered. The investigation into the disappearance of Sarah and John had barely scratched the surface, and the case was far from over. What initially seemed like an isolated mystery was unraveling into something far larger and more dangerous than anyone had expected. As authorities worked tirelessly to track down the members of the secret society that had kept the couple hidden for so long, they uncovered shocking new evidence. It became clear that this society was not an isolated group operating in a small coastal town. It had ties to a larger network of criminals who had been operating along the coast for decades, their activities hidden in plain sight. The society was involved in everything from illegal trade to ritualistic practices, all concealed by the remote wilderness that surrounded the town. Yet, despite their progress, the authorities still couldn't fully explain what had happened to Sarah and John. The discovery of the hidden shelter where they had been kept, and the journal that chronicled their terrifying final days, had answered some questions, but there were still far too many unknowns. It was clear that Sarah and John had been victims of something far greater than they could have ever imagined. The couple had stumbled upon a network of corruption and deception that stretched far beyond their quiet retreat in the woods. The investigation had confirmed that the couple had not vanished by accident. They had been taken, targeted, and kept hidden from the world for decades by a group who would go to any lengths to protect their secrets. Months passed, and new leads began to surface. The investigation, though slow and painstaking, was starting to yield results. Witnesses came forward, some of whom had lived in the town in 1995, and they shared unsettling stories about the days surrounding Sarah and John's disappearance. Several people claimed to have seen strange figures near the cabin that night. Figures that didn't belong, people they didn't recognize. Some described seeing shadowy forms moving in the woods, just beyond the edge of the rental property. These sightings, though brief, painted a picture of a group that was actively monitoring the couple during their stay. In the days following the couple's disappearance, other witnesses came forward, describing odd noises coming from the woods, strange sounds that weren't typical of the usual forest wildlife. There were reports of chanting, eerie whispers, and heavy footsteps that seemed to echo through the trees in the dead of night. People who lived near the beach rental recalled hearing these sounds, but at the time, no one had thought much of it. Now, however, in the wake of the investigation, the pieces were falling into place. It was becoming clear that the strange occurrences around the cabin weren't random. They were connected to the sinister activities of the secret society. Despite these shocking discoveries, however, the final fate of Sarah and John remained shrouded in mystery. There were still no answers to the most crucial question. What had happened to them after they were taken? The discovery of the journal had shed light on their captivity and the increasing sense of fear that overtook them, but it didn't explain how or why they had disappeared without a trace. The shelter where they had been kept, hidden deep in the woods, had provided some clues, but it was not enough to explain the full extent of the conspiracy. It was clear that Sarah and John had stumbled upon something much larger and more powerful than they had ever realized. What began as a vacation getaway had turned into a nightmare from which they couldn't escape. For the people of the town, the investigation was starting to feel like it was touching on a much darker truth, one that had been buried for years. The quiet, peaceful town they had once known was now revealed to be a place where secrets and corruption had festered, hidden beneath the surface. The discovery of the secret society and the web of illegal activities they had been conducting revealed a dark underbelly of life that no one had suspected. What was once a sleepy town was now exposed as a hub for dangerous, illicit operations that had quietly thrived in the shadows. The horrifying realization that Sarah and John's disappearance was part of something much larger left the town shaken to its core. The investigation continued, but with each new lead, the questions grew even more unsettling. Who else had disappeared over the years? How many others had been drawn into the dark world of the secret society, only to be silenced and forgotten? And who were the members of this mysterious group, operating in the shadows for so long? Despite the authorities' best efforts, there were still no answers. The town, once a peaceful and quiet place, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for more revelations to come to light. But one thing was clear. Sarah and John's story was no longer just a local mystery. Their disappearance had uncovered a hidden world of crime, corruption, and fear. The authorities had finally begun to piece together the terrifying truth of what had happened to them. But there was still much to uncover. The investigation was far from over, and every new discovery seemed to bring more questions than answers. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, it became evident that the couple's disappearance was only the tip of the iceberg. The families of Sarah and John, along with the people of the town, would never forget the chilling mystery that had haunted them for decades. For years, the couple's disappearance had been a source of confusion and grief, with no answers to offer closure. But now, thanks to the tireless work of Mark Benson and the investigators, the story was finally beginning to unfold. The truth was darker, more complicated, and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the town would never be the same again. The dark legacy of Sarah and John's disappearance would forever remain a part of the town's history, a chilling reminder of how deeply secrets can be buried. Some mysteries, it seemed, were not meant to be solved without disturbing the darkness lurking beneath the surface. And as more of the truth came to light, it was clear that the couple's disappearance was only the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying story that had yet to fully unfold. If you enjoyed this thrilling investigation into the disappearance of Sarah and John and the secrets that were unearthed, make sure to hit the subscribe button for more mysteries and unsolved cases. Don't forget to ring the bell for notifications so you never miss an update. The world is full of secrets, and the search for the truth is always just beginning.